Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 322. Is Passover really two holidays in one? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are talking about Passover because Passover is coming up. Actually, we're sort of talking about Passover, but we're also talking about a different holiday, which I think it's a different holiday, which is called the Festival of Matzah, Chag HaMatzot. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today, whether we actually have two holidays coming up next week that we have, for some reason, lumped into and consider as one holiday. And sadly, one of the holidays, it's almost like one of the holidays ate the other holiday because we really only celebrate Passover as a real holiday, and we sort of celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Matzot, but I think we could do something more with that. So we're excited to jump into that. Before we do, just a word that right after the holiday of the matzahs, that is Passover, right after that holiday ends, we are going to be starting our mini courses for the Yeshiva. We're going to have 2 sessions of 3 weeks each of mini courses. There are 3 mini courses in each session, led by some of our most awesome guests ever on Judaism Unbound. So we are thrilled about this idea that we are turning our guests into teachers and we are turning our listeners into much more active participants by being a student in one of these classes. So check them out at www.unyeshiva.com or judaismunbound.com/classes. Okay, so let's jump into this conversation. Lex, I'll tell you that I'm thinking about this because my Yeshiva class this semester is called Unreliable Sources. You can't sign up for it because it's already started, so you're going to have to sign up for it next year if you're interested. But we are looking at the primary sources that have to do with all the Jewish holidays. And we have a source sheet, which we'll link to in the show notes, that I put together with all the biblical sources relating to Passover. One of the things that's really hit me that I kind of knew before but didn't fully sink my thinking into is that Passover, as we know it, is actually 2 different holidays in the Bible. One of them is called Passover, and it takes place on the 14th of Nisan at night. And what you do there is you bring a sacrifice in Jerusalem and then eat it. And then following that...
The Paschal Lamb, just to be specific, like the Passover.
The Passover, the Paschal Lamb, which, by the way, that holiday, Passover, has to do almost exclusively with the whole plague of the firstborn. And that basically, of course, connects to the moment of the Exodus itself because in the story, because all the firstborns of Egypt were killed, that was the breaking point at which Pharaoh says, okay, you can, let your people go. But that is like a holiday. Passover is a holiday that almost celebrates or observes a moment in time. There is another holiday, a 7-day holiday called Chag HaMatzot, or the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, or the Feast of the Matzah. And that is a 7-day holiday that begins on the 15th of Nisan. Some say the Jewish day begins at night. It's not clear that that was true in the Bible. Whether it is or it isn't, I still think that the 7-day holiday, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is a different holiday, and it doesn't mark a moment in time. It marks a process or a period. There are a variety of pieces of evidence of this that, again, I don't know how much we want to get into the evidence. We have the source sheet there so that if anybody's interested, you can click on it and read these texts for yourself and decide for yourself if you're seeing one holiday or 2 holidays. But if you look at those sources, I think you will see 2 holidays. And one of the pieces of evidence that this makes me even more confident that I'm right about seeing it this way is that the holiday of Sukkot, which takes place exactly 6 months away from Passover, meaning it's on the exact opposite of the calendar. It also is a 7-day holiday that has a 1-day holiday attached to it. In the case of Sukkot, the additional holiday is on the end of the holiday, whereas for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the additional holiday, is on the beginning of the holiday. So in a sense, we have bookends of one day that are bookending the whole year. But right attached to the two bookends are these other bookends, which are each 7-day holidays. So the symmetry of it makes me even more sure that this view is correct.
There you go. Starting with some big hot takes. There's 2 holidays, not one. We're certain of a symmetry in the calendar. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about the 2 holidays in one situation with Passover either. It's easier to think about with Sukkot because I feel like there's just sort of there's like an accepted conversation thread around Shmini Atzeret about, oh, is it part of Sukkot? Is it not part of Sukkot? What do we do with this? And then Simchat Torah, which is a later holiday that's not mentioned in the Bible at all, like also gets into that debate. But with Passover,
but by the way,
right.
But the Bible is very clear that Shmini Atzeret is a different holiday.
Yeah. And then it's just a matter of whether we listen to it later, which is a question that, of course, comes up all the time, whether we actually go with what the Bible says or go with what rabbis said later, which often are not the same. But yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in sort of the then what's of the 2 Passovers in one conversation, or the 2 Chag HaMatzot. Like, my default word is Passover.
Right, it's very hard. It becomes very hard.
Yeah, I'm figuring out the language. But like, there's a number of things at play here. And to add another wrinkle, I mentioned there's a wrinkle in the fall where we have Simchat Torah, this later situation that gets sort of plopped on. So there's actually 3 things to discuss: Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, and Simchat Torah. Not going to go into that today. On Passover, similarly, there's another symmetry where we have the 2 holidays that are mentioned in the Bible in some form, the Passover and Festival of Matzah, Chag HaMatzot. There's also a fast day. There's a fast of the firstborn that has been tacked on to the front before that 14th night, before the Passover night. So I think that's interesting because I've also like spent a lot of time trying to figure out my own practices with all of this. And one of my personal frustrations, not with like others, but kind of with myself, is that I haven't really landed after 31 years of Passovers. I haven't landed on what my real kavanah, my real like intention is after the Seders. The Seders, I think, are this really rich idea. And by the way, I'm saying Seders plural because some people have multiple. Traditionally, my family has had one, but I still don't know what my practices are other than like I keep the kosher for Passover rules and I don't eat bread and I don't eat other forms of leavening. So that's, something. And it is serving as a reminder, right? Like we just talked a lot about food. And so when I eat differently that week, it does sort of rejigger in my head, oh yeah, it's a holiday about freedom, and matzah that I'm eating, it's a symbol of freedom. I also, personally, I make sure to eat matzah every single day of the holiday because it's just a reminder to me of like what is happening. Matzah is part of the Exodus story. But other than that, I don't have any practices that aren't eating that I've done every day. With Sukkot, it's like part of the holiday in the fall is you hang in the sukkah for some amount of each day. At least that's sort of by the book what you would do is you hang in the sukkah. Some people sleep in the sukkah. Some people eat in the sukkah. With Passover, other than just eating matzah, like there's not a way in which it really forces you to be conscious after the Seders. So I'm trying to figure out in this conversation how I might do that.
I mean, to me, the reason why looking at it as 2 separate holidays is valuable is one piece of it is that I'm kind of a Seder skeptic, and I've said this in different ways over the course of this show over the years. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should cancel their Seders and not do their Seders, but the reality is that I think a lot of people aren't getting out of their Seders what I wish that we would all be getting out of the Seders, and I'm not sure how fixable it is in the short term. But if we look at the next 7 days as a different holiday, which I, again, am asserting that was biblically the case. We're not making up some cool idea that people should try. I'm saying this was actually the case, that we can potentially ask ourselves, well, what is this holiday for? as we have many times on this show. And I would encourage you, Lex, the way you're thinking about it, I would encourage you to think about the Chag HaMatzot the way that you are so excited to be thinking about Shemitah, which is almost as a blank slate, almost as something that we have not actually observed for 2,000 years. And we have a chance to invent it or reinvent it now. And that would be my question. And I would say, for example, that it may be that it actually has nothing to do with the Exodus, right? Or little to do with the Exodus, in the sense that I think that there was a pre-biblical version of Passover, and we could talk about that later, that had absolutely nothing to do with the Exodus. The Bible sort of layered the Exodus onto Passover and Chag HaMatzot and the Feast of the Matzah. And the rabbis kind of doubled down on that in a certain way. They took Passover much more seriously than the rest of the holiday. And as a result, Passover kind of ate Chag HaMatzot. And so we are mad at the rabbis for, making Shemitah a dead letter. And I want to express a similar anger at them for making the Feast of the Matzot a dead letter and say, well, really, what could we do with this holiday? So part of my question is, what might this holiday be about in a kind of originalist sense? But part of my idea also is like, well, maybe we have an opportunity. We have a holiday without a purpose. Maybe there's an opportunity there to do something with it that we need today. What things are we trying to accomplish? By the way, that's why I'm excited about things like the Exodus Alliance. They're still, in my opinion, focused on the Seder, and I wish that they, would go beyond that, right? I mean, I'd like to have not only Seders in front of the banks. Maybe we could do something even more than that. But anyway, the idea that we might say, well, the most pressing issues in our time are climate change. The Chag HaMatzot, and I'd love to talk about this later, actually, I think has a really interesting connection to agriculture in a way that maybe this becomes the climate change holiday. I don't know. I want to work that through with you, but that's what's at stake, I think.
Cool. Okay, so great. We really disagree. I want this to continue being about the Exodus. Actually, that story that is, in the book of Exodus and involves leaving Egypt, experiencing oppression and finding a form of freedom. I totally, completely want that in our Marie Kondo quest not to be something that we tidy up out of the picture. I'm grateful to you for really asking in the way that we love to do, should we even have the Exodus as part of this or not? Whatever the two holidays, 1 day and 7 days, are, I would like them both to tie to the Exodus. But they could tie in different ways, and they could take drastically different forms. I'm really interested in what you said about how the Exodus Alliance, which, for those who didn't listen to that episode, they're doing Seders, although they're not quite doing full Seders in the by the book sense, but they're doing a form of Jewish ritual, including some excerpts of the Passover Seder, maybe the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And they're doing that in the streets outside of various banks, Chase Bank, others, etc. We asked a question last week about translation and how whenever you translate from one language to another, you kind of have to decide what the essence of a word is and then render it in the new language. So you said it's still a Seder. To me, Exodus Alliance is calling it a Seder. Is it a Seder? That's an open question, right? If the essence of a Seder is the festive meal, is sharing food with people, I think a lot of these events are not going to have a big festive meal. Logistically and otherwise, they're not going to do that. If the essence is telling the story, sounds like many of them will be doing that. Now, they'll be telling a story that's refracted through our contemporary times, that's blending the Pharaoh narrative with corporate carbon pharaohs today. And so there's a way in which we could duke it out over whether that's a Seder. I actually don't care that much if it is or is not a Seder. What excites me is that it's creative, that it's in a new context in the streets versus in the home. And what's funny is I had a whole thing last week about how I think it should be permissible for us to do that on the first day, on the day that the Seders are. But I actually think that the fact that they have chosen to position these events not on the first day is an argument for how these could be sort of the quote unquote Chag HaMatzot part, which is funny because I just mentioned there's probably less food at these, and that's the festival of matzah. So there's like an irony at play. But that could be holding down that role. And maybe what Chag HaMatzot is sort of the lived, actionable commitment to creating freedom in the world. Or I mean, in this case, it's not necessarily freedom, but it's connected to freedom. It's, the fight against climate change and making sure not only is there freedom, but that like humans are able to exist or other species are able to exist for as long as possible. I think the Exodus story is in potential an incredibly useful story to use for fighting for values that I believe are good in the world. That's why I think we shouldn't ditch it in this effort. I don't think it is always used that way. I think lots of people use the Exodus story to hammer home values I actually despise. They use this story as a way of showing a form of Jewish superiority versus the Egyptians or versus sort of all civilization because our God is sort of the winner. I'm not saying that inherently it is sort of a value positive text, but I think there's enough juiciness there for us to deploy in a positive way that I would like to keep it as part. But what that means, I mean, for me, keeping it as part could be that we're translating the different plagues as, different parts of the apparatus that upholds, that contributes and invests in climate change. Like, that's what I mean by continuing to have the Exodus as a part of the story. And you might take that as, well, that's kind of a new thing. The last thing I'd say is I am sad that in the Exodus story that we have, there are so many tens. And in the Seder, there's so many fours. So we've got 10 plagues, we got different tens. And then in the Seder, there's a bunch of fours, 4 cups of wine, 4 children, 4 questions. And in between that, there's 7. I think if we had a well-known 7 that was part of this story, we have lots of 7s that are part of other Jewish things. But if we had that, I think it'd be very easy to say, each day of the holiday, we're going to do, the first way. If this holiday were about the creation of the world, we could say, on the first day of the holiday, we're going to think about the first day of creation. And on the second day, the second day. We don't have 7 segments of the Exodus story. Maybe we should create them. Maybe we should find them. And then each day could be sort of a relationship to that 1/7.
My question for you, though, is other than just because this is how you inherited it, I guess I'm wondering, like, why you're tied specifically to having not Passover, but Chag HaMatzot be about Exodus if there was an alternative, right? Meaning, like, I'm sort of suggesting, and by the way, like, this is a thought experiment. I'm suggesting that Passover remain about the Exodus, but that potentially Chag HaMatzot, because it is a blank slate, is open to something new if we wanted it to be. And the question to me is, like, why don't you want that?
I mean, what's funny is I think I do want that in certain senses, but I want to play the game that we like to play, both we and Jews historically like to play, where we do something new and we find anchor points in an existing narrative that then strengthens whatever we're doing and says it's super tried and true and ancient. And right. I'm aware that it's like what I'm endorsing is kind of something that others could argue is like, I don't know, manufactured, or like we should fight climate change and then we should cherry pick. I'm going to use the word cherry pick because that's how people criticize this, right? They say that if you have a relationship to Torah or to something Jewish and you just sort of look for the stuff that connects with whatever values you have today, that you're cherry picking and you're not actually devoted to the Jewish text. You're only devoted to your own values and you're just finding whatever you want to find. And yes, that is what I want to do. I trust the communities of people that I am part of and share a world with today more than I do the communities of people that wrote the Exodus story. And so I think we should identify what we want to spend 7 days roughly in the spring doing. Something that isn't totally anchored to this moment, something that's broad enough that we could envision it happening for 100 years or 200 years. I mean, God willing, we'll all exist, like people will exist long enough that that's even a relevant question. I don't know if that's the case. Well, like there's reason to be skeptical of it. But like, I'd like at least to presume the world, committing to the continued existence of the world and fighting climate change. That is pretty broad. I believe we can anchor that on elements of the Exodus story. We can look to ways in which the Exodus story is one in which water sources get totally screwed with, the ways in which land and animals get totally screwed with, and human beings get, like, every component of an ecosystem gets screwed. By the way, the God who is, quote unquote, our God in the story is the one doing a lot of that. Not all of it. There's ways in which the structure of Egyptian society sort of inherently does some of that victimizing work. But like, I'm interested in how, like, I'm fascinated by the fact that we have this story that already has that in potential. And look, Dan, you could follow up and say, well, there's a million other books that we could use that also explore ways in which human beings and animals and land and water get screwed with. And that could connect to climate change as well. And I'd say, yeah, let's do that too. Let's have our, quote unquote, Haftorah readings, but they're not like books of the prophets. They're works of contemporary literature, nonfiction or fiction, that connect to the destruction of the planet and our fight against it. Like, to me, let's do that, but then let's play the game where we tie it to the Exodus. Like, that's my argument.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too distant from what you're saying. I would only suggest that we do that tying after the fact. And it may end up that the Exodus story is the best way to tie it, but it may end up that there's something else, and I would argue that we should be open to the possibility that something else, only because it increases it increases the material that we can make our art out of. Why put in restrictions until and unless we have to? So what I'm suggesting is that when we imagine reinventing a Jewish holiday in some fashion, I think there are really three possibilities. One is that we can reach back for a more ancient version of that holiday and maybe find something more powerful for today in that more ancient version than we find in the more recent version. That's possibility number one. Possibility number two is to take the more recent version that we've inherited, right, the one from the last couple hundred years, let's say, and we can really build on that and reinterpret that in some way. And that has the virtue of feeling more linear, more connected to something that happened recently. And then the third possibility, I think, is to create some completely new connection, possibly to something that happened in history that happened more recently than the ancient thing. So, for example, let's say for some reason you wanted to make the 7 days of Passover connected to the Holocaust. You wouldn't be able to do that until this last century because the Holocaust hadn't happened yet, right? So all of those three things, I think, are open as possibilities. Now, the real thing that I think I'm driving for is that the first question we should ask ourselves is, what is it that we're looking for in a Jewish holiday? In other words, what would happen on a Jewish holiday that would make us really excited that that holiday was coming? Find it really meaningful. Like, we're really, for better or worse, I'm also, not the biggest fan of Yom Kippur, but I think a lot of people are big fans of Yom Kippur because they appreciate the idea that once a year we have to do some stock taking, and we have to try to right relationships or to put, even to like throw away our sins in some ritual way that feels like a cleansing. And I actually think that a lot of those themes that people associate with the high holidays, they actually feel pretty powerful and look forward to it. I think that people do look forward to the Seder, largely because it is a gathering of family. I think for the same reason that we look forward to Thanksgiving. There are a few other elements. I think people enjoy some of the elements of the Seder and look forward to it. So I think in a certain way, the Seder is succeeding. I don't know that there are that many people who look forward to the other 7 or 8 days of Passover. And so what I'm hoping for is that we can try to think about, and we can also encourage people to think about on your own and let us know what might happen over those 7 days that would make us feel like something really important happened to us, whether that's spiritually or something else. Now, let me give you an example, and then I can tie it. For me, the one that I have ties into the more ancient pre-biblical version of Passover as I understand it. The pre-biblical version of Passover as I understand it is one where the Exodus story hasn't happened yet. So the Passover rituals, very much like the ones that we see in the Bible, already did exist, but the Exodus story didn't happen yet. How could that possibly be?
Meaning the sacrifice of the lamb and the eating of
the
some
matzah,
kind of unleavened bread. Yeah.
Correct, in the eating of unleavened bread. So the lamb, let's put to the side, it's part of it too, but the matzah is a little bit easier. I heard a podcast, an Israeli podcast, that described this, and it just seemed very right that from an agricultural standpoint, the Feast of Matzot and Passover take place very much in the transition from barley being the main crop that's growing in the land of Israel to wheat being the main crop that's growing in the land of Israel. And that they would actually throw out all of their wheat from the year before as a kind of act of faith in God, that we can throw out all of our wheat stores and all of our yeast stores. And they made yeast by soaking wheat in water. It wasn't like they got yeast somewhere else. Yeast and wheat were together. So they would throw all of that out, and they would kind of trust the miracle that we're going to get new wheat in the next year, and that we're going to be able to make new yeast by soaking wheat in water, which apparently takes about a week. So during that week, they would throw out all of their old yeast, so they couldn't have bread because they had thrown it away. And they had to eat all that was left in that time, which was barley. And barley doesn't rise in the same way that bread does because it has a lower gluten content and whatever. So these flatbreads that they would be eating during this week of transition would have to be, flatbreads because they didn't have wheat. So I'm thinking, okay, what if those 7 days of Passover became for us a week of trying out a new way to live? Let's say, for example, that I am a meat eater. We talked about this last week, and I really want to be a vegetarian or a vegan even, but it feels like a big commitment to change. I might say, let me wait for Passover I do the same, right? It's hard not to do it. Let me wait for the festival of Matzot, the festival of matzah to come along. And this year I am going to give up meat. It's kind of like giving up meat for Lent. But the idea that I would give up something that I'm actually considering giving up in my life, but I want to try it out for a week before I fully decide. And maybe this week I find that, the flesh is weak and I'm not able to give it up. But next year I give it up again for a week. Eventually, maybe I get to a point where I've found a way that I can give up meat and it functions that way. So that's attractive to me. It's not just meat. And, you said let's be careful about Marie Kondoing our Passover. I actually am thinking no, let's actually make Passover the Marie Kondoing holiday. Let's actually make Passover the time of year where we experiment with living our life in a new way for just 1 week, and then we see what happens. And that, to me, we could then tell the story backwards to tie it not to the Exodus per se, although I'm sure you and I could, in 5 minutes, come up with a way to tie it to the Exodus, but we could tell that story where we're tying it to that ancient root of the Feast of Matzot, and thereby claiming an unbroken chain, which I think is the Jewish thing to do.
Cool. I mean, look, I think that's a funky idea, using this 7-day period as like a trial run. I mean, it's funny because we live in a world where you can do 7-day free trials for all sorts of things online. And it's well known to a lot of us that the reason you do that, or the reason the companies do that, is because a lot of the time you have to give your credit card information or whatever, and you forget to cancel it. And so then you end up paying. And actually that in a positive sense would kind of be awesome in this case. If you're being what you aspirationally want to be for 7 days, and then you proverbially forget to cancel it. So for 7 days, you gave up meat, Dan, let's say. And then you, quote unquote, forget to cancel the credit card that you entered, then you're still a vegetarian moving forward, and you've successfully made a change in your life that's really awesome. So I think that's funky, and I endorse you doing that. I'm flashing back to what I said before, where I, in passing, made a reference to it's a bummer. If we had the 7 days of creation, if we had the 7 that's present in the creation story, where God creates the world in 6 days and then rests on the 7th day, that would be nice, because then each day of the holiday could be anchored to that. And now I'm actually thinking to myself, we actually could do that. I'll back out to where my thought process was. I appreciate you saying we should start with what's the holiday for? I think, I actually don't know whether Passover is the best holiday to utilize to have a climate change holiday, or a world focused holiday, not just saving the planet. I think it would be good for Judaism to have a holiday whose primary purpose is focusing on the sustained existence of the world and of human and animal existence on that world. I think that would be good. When I think through in my head which holidays are well suited for that, My first instinct is that like the logical one would be Rosh Hashanah. The logical one would be the one that comes nowadays at the beginning of the calendar year. Now, we've talked in the past about how in the Bible, Rosh Hashanah in Tishrei is actually the 7th month. It's not the first month, but like whatever. Now it has become the beginning of the year, and it's actually the day on which humanity was created. It's not the day that the creation story started, but it's the day of the 6th day. It's when humans were created, according to like later Jewish texts. And so it would sort of be logical that on the day that human beings are created, you have a holiday devoted to the sustained existence of human beings on the planet. That said, you were talking about Yom Kippur, but I think Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they're not as much of a blank slate. The holidays themselves and the 10 days that encompass them in between, where you're focusing on sort of self-improvement and on ways that you've wronged others and how you can right those wrongs. Like, it's kind of, I don't know, busy. It's the schedule is less free to fit in new ritual ideas. Now, I'd love to think radically and really say that doesn't even matter. We should replace, like, I'm open to that. But that set of holidays in the fall is actually really self-focused. And I'm not saying that cynically, like they're selfish, but like they're about an individual level of human existence and less about community or world. And so I would not be ready to say that Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur is the right one to do this. I think Passover is closer. It's closer because Passover, maybe the move is we say, so Passover has been experienced by a lot of people as like sort of the holiday of Jewish peoplehood. A group of people called the Israelites leave Egypt, and then the rest of the Bible is sort of the like congealing of that people in a particular land. And this holiday is where you mark sort of the emergence of, wow, Israel, not like the place, but the people, Israel. But what I would say is, maybe we actually look closer at the text again. Multiple times, this text emphasizes that it's actually not just Jews that are part of this group leaving Egypt. That's true in the Bible. It says mixed multitude. It's true. Forget the broad phrase mixed multitude. We know like Zipporah is Moses' wife and she's not an Israelite. And she's like part of this. She's one of the few named people that leaves Egypt, right? And there's others. So we should say, we've been treating that as kind of a bug, not a feature. But if we made this holiday one that's actually about humanity as a whole and beyond humanity, animals and plant life and like the world, which those are really easy. We don't have for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or Shavuot, we don't have like a bunch of animals that get sick as part of the story. That's literally part of the Passover story. And it's obvious how we could think about our own culpability in that and how we could try to work with animals and on their behalf. So like, I'm starting to think like maybe there is a real opening here for us to say that the blank slate that is the latter days of Passover after the Seders, maybe it's where we say as Jews, this is not a holiday about us. And so then my take would be like, well then maybe it becomes for the lead-in holiday, the one-night holiday, maybe it all of a sudden becomes like unkosher to have no non-Jews at your Seder.
I've thought a lot about Hanukkah becoming the holiday in which we celebrate our interconnections with other people that aren't Jewish, right? And I've thought about Hanukkah being that holiday specifically to kind of stick it to the Maccabees, because they were the opposite. And, I like the idea of reversing their holiday to be against their values. That said, if we're talking about connecting it to the Exodus story, I actually think it would be really interesting I think we could come up with 7 non-Jews who play a significant role in the experience of the Exodus, right? Mm-hmm. There's Pharaoh's daughter. There's Zipporah, Moses' wife. There is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. There's the mixed multitude that leaves Egypt with the Israelites. That's talked about directly in the Bible. So I don't know. I think I'm up to 5 or 6. The point is that I think that if you were so inclined, you could mine this story for 7 characters who play a critical role in the story of the Jews who are not Jewish, and then or not Israelite, right? So that was just like an interesting concept to me as you were talking.
I'm still trying to think of like other than sort of mental intentions, characters we'd connect to, or like what's the ritual action?
The ritual action has to connect to the purpose. So I think that's why I think that we're thinking wrong about how to do ritual reimagination of Judaism, because I think that the first thing is that we do have to establish the purpose of this reimagined holiday, and then we can think about what the ritual enactments are going to be.
So I think what we're disagreeing about is the sequence here. What I'm hearing from you is a notion of how ritual works where it traces to an idea. So there's a core idea or belief, and from that core idea or belief, one draws rituals that help to symbolically, or maybe even not symbolically, maybe there's a literal element of it. They manifest whatever the idea is. And so if the core idea is getting rid of one's sins at a certain time of year, then the action that traces from that is throwing bread into a body of water, or throwing something into a body of water, or sacrificing a scapegoat that you have sort of given your sins to. I don't actually agree that it should always go in that direction. And that's what we're coming up against. I actually think that, and maybe this is like the educator in me who's like, if I have a mnemonic device for something to teach people, they're going to remember it better. And whatever the thing is that I want them to learn, it's going to stick better. And so my approach to ritual is actually not just coming up with the core idea. It's coming up with the ritual and then backdooring the idea. And look, I'm not saying you fully discard a set of ideas. I'm saying we just need to combine it so that we don't come to some really beautiful idea that is really challenging to fit into a ritualized manifestation.
No, I totally agree with that. But what I'm saying is but where would you draw the ritual from? Would you make them up, or are you saying that we should really focus on the existing rituals and re-understanding what they might mean, which I would argue is actually what has happened originally to the Chag HaMatzot, right? Because my claim is that we have been eating matzah, so to speak, during Chag HaMatzot from time immemorial, since before the Exodus story even happened. And the only thing that has changed is the reason why we eat this particular food over time.
And that's why I'm saying that we should come up with ritual and not just idea behind it, because the idea behind it changes a lot easier than like often the ritual actually continues, like eating matzah, through multiple iterations of the idea behind it. I'm bringing up frameworks like the number 7 because I like the number 7, but also because it's a number. Like I said, mnemonic device, because I think we need. Look, it could be body part. It could be that like there's a progression from head to heart to feet to like I don't like I'm thinking of all sorts of different kinds of framing devices that are actually not rituals. They're like formats that you then plug rituals into. And I do think that you have to really reckon, not you, like we all, as we create ritual, we have to be simultaneously thinking about the intention of the ritual and that format. Because if we don't, there's a lot of really wonderful ideas that float around in people's heads, and including Passover. Like, I think there are good ideas that are part of the Seder, independent from Exodus, that are part of the Exodus story. And my struggle every year is that I don't know how to actualize them, because I think the people that created this were thinking less about that.
For sure.
They were thinking, and so I want to be like, okay, the number 7 is something that might work, or 5, or 9, or 4, or 10. Like having a number that you were to work through could be it. It could be a word. I mean, it's amazing how sticky the dreidel is for people that don't know that. Like, we've got 4 letters on the dreidel. A great miracle happened there is what they are said to mean. Now, that's not what the original intention was. They were random German letters that got placed on the letter, placed on the dreidel to tell you how many pieces you get to put in or out when you spin them. But now they mean a great miracle happened there. And so I think the dreidel makers were right to think about the game dreidel before they thought about what it would stand for.
But I think that when you think about, I think that's a good example. Like when my guess, again, I don't think we know this, but my guess about why did a dreidel become associated with Hanukkah? My guess is because it's really cold in Europe, And so people were doing indoor things. And one of the fun indoor things they had to do during the winter was playing this game with a top and betting. And at some point, somebody said, "Hey, I got an idea about how to tie this to Hanukkah." So when we're thinking about so it's interesting because I think we're seeing a little bit of maybe a difference in the way that you and I approach this, because definitely I would approach it first with the idea, and then I would try to figure out. I totally agree with you that ultimately it has to translate itself into rituals, otherwise it doesn't go anywhere. But my directionality would be to say, first, what's the idea? Second, how do I sort of connect that idea to some more ancient story? It doesn't necessarily have to be the one that this holiday has always been connected to, but it could be. And then my third would be, now how do I take those two things and connect them to a ritual? And that ritual might be something that we make up, something that was always attached to this holiday, but we're now reinterpreting it, or something like the dreidel, which happens in this time of year for other reasons. Like what happens in America, in the Western, Northern Hemisphere or whatever, like what happens in spring, that might be things that we don't usually do other than in spring. That would seem to me the natural place to draw new rituals from. But anyway, that would be the direction that I would go from. And it sounds like you would go not quite in that. You would go in a different order, as you would be trying to figure out how to reimagine and re-ritualize a holiday that was more blank slatey. Is that right?
Yeah.
So how would you proceed?
This is good. Like, I believe in the potential of both of these, but this is a great moment, I hope, for our podcast and like how we can continue co-creating rituals moving forward, because like really, truly, thoroughly, the way I go about planning almost anything is not starting with core idea. It's starting with ritual or framework. And so, what I'd say to communicate that is like, if I am talking about sports and Judaism to a room full of people on Zoom or elsewhere, I have a set of ideas that I tend to talk about in the intersection of sports and Judaism and how Judaism and sports fandom are parallel to each other or whatever. I give a different version of that presentation every time. Because if I'm talking to a crew in New England, I'm going to talk about the Red Sox. I start that process and I say, I'm going to talk about the Red Sox. I have no idea what my core idea is related to the Red Sox, but I know that I'm going to look at the history of the Boston Red Sox. I'm going to do some Google deep dives. I'm going to find interesting ways in which, Fenway Park, which is where they play, is a kind of pilgrimage site. I'm going to think about how certain kinds of figures in Boston Red Sox history, including their enemies, a Bucky Dent, like certain people are kinds of enemies in the way that Pharaoh is. I'm going to think about, shrines and the role that a Ted Williams plays as a kind of hero figure. I'm not going to do that if I'm talking to people in Denver. In Denver, I'm going to go and deep dive the Broncos and the Avalanche and the Rockies and all of their local sports things. And look, a lot of the time, I'm going to end up conveying the same things, roughly. I'm going to find a version of hero worship or shrine or pilgrimage or whatever that works in Denver, but I'm not organizing it that way. And I think that it's important often to not organize it that way, because when you start from the content, when you start from the ritual and then back into the idea, I think we somehow presume that it's only like little kids that learn best through like structured ritual and songs and stories and whatever. Like, that's adults too. And I think that holidays, especially Passover as it has existed, but all holidays, they're pedagogical devices that are meant to convey ideas or like ways of sensibilities, like ways of relating to the world. And so we have to convey them in pedagogically successful ways. Everybody's taken the class from the college professor where they're like, this person is brilliant, but they don't know how to convey any of what they think. They like, I can tell they really know their shit, and none of it is being received by me. And so that's a problem. That's something we have to supersede.
Well, I think the mirror image of that problem is the professor who's like super entertaining and has all the pedagogical tools, but doesn't really have anything to say. Like, you're like, well, what was the point here? Right? It was a lot of fun, but what was the point? So I think it's definitely sort of in between those two. I mean, as you were talking, it was interesting because as you were talking about like sports, like all of a sudden it hit me like, well, what is it that we do in the spring in the United States that we don't do other times? sometimes we have the baseball season. So then I was thinking like the bat, like that's Moses' staff, and the ball, that's the hailstones. And like I could imagine that if you were so inclined, you could figure out how to explain, right? Think about the book of Esther. We've talked about, that these are things that were already happening at this time of year in that society, right? If you read a little bit about Purim, you will see all of the practices for Purim that we think of as Purim practices are actually practices that happen in every spring festival because they don't have anything to do with Esther and Mordecai. They have to do with rites of spring and all kinds of reversals and all kinds of celebrations like that. So somebody at some point said, hey, we do all these cool spring things. Like, let's attach a Jewish story to them to make it understandable why we do these things. So I could easily imagine somebody who is inclined to explain that actually going to baseball games is a Jewish activity for Passover. And that is why it starts in April. It's not because of spring in America, it's because of Passover. And you could do it. And it would actually be a fun experiment. And actually think you should do it because I think you would really enjoy doing it. But then we would say, okay, and then we start to look at it that way. We say, well, obviously hockey is tied to Hanukkah and they both start with an H. I mean, how would you start to do this? Like, I could imagine that you would do a really kind of fun thing. It would be really interesting to have a conversation like this that's not tied to any particular holiday that's coming up and saying, like, let's actually make an inventory of all the things that we wish Judaism had a holiday about, or all the things that we wish that Judaism somehow made us better at. And then I think on that list, we would have things like, how do we be better to animals? How would we be better to the environment? And I'm thinking about things that we don't currently have, because we currently have, how do we fix broken relationships? How do we cleanse ourselves from a sense that we've done wrong, right? Those are ones that we do have. What are the list of the things that we don't have? We don't have something that really celebrates our interconnections with other peoples in the world, right? And it would be really interesting to sort of take that whole list and then kind of like look at the rituals / holidays / other tools we have in our toolbox and say like, well, where would this purpose fit best in terms of either the rituals kind of seem to fit it best or the time of year makes most sense for this to be? And if you did a project like that, I'm just really curious what would come out of it. Because I think that fundamentally that was what the rabbis had to do after the destruction of the temple. I think they kind of they said basically everything that we've ever had to practice Judaism is gone. And then I think they kind of back-ended all of that stuff and reconnected it to all of these existing holidays and rituals. Some of them they did an outstanding job for, and some of them, like Shemitah, they kind of whiffed on. And I wonder a little bit whether one of the reasons maybe they whiffed on the Chag HaMatzot, the 7 days of Passover, I wonder if it's because like the way of observing that actually wasn't broken. Like they could still observe it the same way, just eat matzah. It wasn't that great, but nothing had happened that really stopped them from observing it that way. Whereas the holiday of Passover, the one night, that was completely gone because the Paschal Lamb was gone and the temple was gone. So they were allowed to reinvent Passover because the way that it could have been celebrated before was completely gone. It's interesting to me that in our time today, it's exactly the opposite, right? We are all struggling to reinvent Passover because the Seder, nothing has really happened to make the Seder not work. In fact, people kind of like it. So rather than wasting our time reinventing the Seder all the time, which if you look at all the Haggadahs that are coming out every year, you see like everybody's attention is only on reinventing the Seder. I would suggest like, let's forget about it. Let's leave the Seder. Let it be for a while. Let's focus on the other 7 days because basically they're broken. We can still observe them the way that we have. We could just eat matzah, but it feels to me like for most people, first of all, they're not doing that. And second of all, like, it really seems to have lost most meaning for most people. So I think it really is an opportunity there.
Yeah. So I'm appreciative that you brought up the sheer quantity of new Haggadahs and even not full Haggadahs, but like Haggadah supplements that organizations make, including us. We've done 4 question supplements, all that. But like, it's an investment of resources that might not be on a collective level like the best use of everyone's time. Like if we were really thinking about how to make Passover optimally awesome in terms of individual experience by those doing it, in terms of communal connection, in terms of contribution to the world and justice. If we were going to ask all those questions, I don't think our takeaway would be like 1,000 new Haggadahs and Haggadah supplements every year, each of which is being used by like some relatively small number of Seders. I do happen to love Haggadot.com and the exercise that people can craft Haggadahs that are like of their own family and of their own context and seeking to achieve particular goals. But I do think like having publishers churn these out over and over because you'll get some basic amount of buyership is cynical and crummy. I do want to close with a note of optimism about Seders. I mean, you started by saying you're a Seder skeptic. I really was touched by what Madeline Canfield said when we spoke with her and Nate DeGroot, because what she said about Seders is, in my experience, true for me. As a one-time experience, I think Seders are not particularly effective. I don't think people going to one Seder, especially as kids, which is when a lot of Jews by birth have their earliest Seders, like I think that's unlikely to be a thing that you do and then you're changed in a deep way, which is what you sort of set as the bar. And I think you should set it as, I think that should be the bar. But I do think there's a real truth to what she said about how the practice of doing it year after year, I actually do think that it does something substantial to people. I don't think it's trivial to engage with the idea of oppression and slavery and freedom every year as a religious practice. Like even at my Seders that we're not doing so, our Seder was not using like justice Haggadahs and justice supplements. That's not what we did growing up. But like we were having fun. We were like, there were tchotchkes around on the Seder. There were games. It was enjoyable. Almost any Seder, no matter what Haggadah you're using or no Haggadah at all, engages with questions of making the world more fundamentally just. And I think that soaks into people, not after one time, but after an ongoing relationship with it over years. And Madeline Canfield said, like, that sort of points to the power of ritual, that it's actually not meant to do anything as its own one-off time. It's meant to do something over that continual year-by-year engagement. By the way, I also think that adults experiencing the Seder for the first time actually do sometimes have a transformative experience the first time, including non-Jews who are just like blown away that there's a religious ritual that tells a story about a people emerging from slavery and like tying it to contemporary questions. But we need to actively take on the project of making it better. And even as I say all that, I'm actually with you that in a holiday that in our current form is much longer than one day, because we haven't really segmented the two holidays off yet, I think that we would benefit from allocating our resources more, ideally 7/8 of our resources to the remainder of the days. And so that's going to be my effort this year.
But actually, as you were talking more, I was thinking maybe we should do like a Judaism Unbound Haggadah for the whole 8 days of the holiday, 7 days, right? That it would be the Seder and also
the
some
after
kind of
party Haggadah.
Yeah, some kind of after Haggadah thing, like some kind of. And the problem there is that we are not, at least not yet, asserting a new set of rituals for those 7 days. That's still in experimentation and in the mode of, maybe one day. So I don't know exactly what that would say, but I'm intrigued. So maybe it's something that we'll talk about.
Yeah, I hope so. On that note, we are going to close this out. And it's a good note because if you have ideas, if you have rituals, whichever order they come to you in, ritual then idea, idea then ritual, send them our way. We love hearing from folks about the ways in which Passover is changed as a result of listening to our podcast. We've heard some of that over the years. We do have, I'll name that on our website, we still have Passover Unbound from years past with a variety of different resources you can use in your Seder. We have 4 questions that we've come up with in different years. So now it's like 16 or 20 questions from the combination of years we've submitted them. But basically, we love hearing how you take your own connection to Jewish experimentation and change and build it into your Seder. So be in touch with us, letting us know how you've done so. And you can do that in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Twitter and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And third, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way, and you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.